I will open the floor to questions in just a moment. As a point of order, this will work, I think, exactly the same as it did in the previous session. If you would raise your hand, I will handle the calling on folks so that our presenters can focus on answering the questions. Aaron will come around with a mic. I would ask you, since we are in the process of welcoming new scholars, if you would introduce yourselves by name so that we might get to know one another. So I will open the floor in a second, but to get the conversation going, I'd like to ask a question of all three of our panelists. And this comes out of, last week our panelists did virtual presentations as a first run and a first set of conversations about their papers. And I've been struck by a particular question that was asked during your Q&A, Jessica. And I'd like to put that thought to all three of you. So in this context of modern periodicals and modern mechanized printing, an audience member raised the idea of non-codex formats as being better at capturing intimacy, in this case, the intimacy of the editorial process. But it struck me that this idea of bibliographic intimacy operates in all three of your papers. So, Sharmeen, in your case, the intimacy of a community library, Javiera, in your case, in multiple ways, including the physical intimacy first of privy paper, and also the intimacy of the embodied knowledge that you bring to your work as a bookbinder, or from your work as a bookbinder. And so, as we invite you into the intimacy of this bibliographic community, I wonder if the three of you could reflect on the ways in which that idea operates within your papers. And I'll ask you to start, Jessica.
Yes, so this question was posed in part because the poem Boy Breaking Glass, if anyone noticed, the periodical version says, for Mark Crawford, from whom the commission. Mark Crawford, father actually of the renowned scholar Margot Natalie Crawford, was an editor of another journal, and he had commissioned a poem from Brooks. It didn't end up working out, and so Hoyt Fuller had asked for it. But whenever it reappears in the Mecca, it says, to Mark Crawford, from whom the commission. Kanoe Nishikawa had asked this question as a instance of, or like, how to think about, these differences. And we discussed basically how the intimacy of the periodical is more evident, especially in For Mike Crawford, because it has a certain kind of presentism to it. The periodical does, and the For is able to exemplify that, and it also, you can see this entire network of cultural makers within this one poem that is not quite as visible or not quite as potent, I think, in the codex, and thus the kind of two feels a little bit more like the lyric invocation. Yes, but I'm curious to hear what you all have to say.
Hello? Oh, okay. I'm really interested about this question because I think part of my research has to do with the intimacy that is developed between the object and the person that is looking at it. And I mean looking in a very broad sense, especially because when approximating myself to these documents, I not only have to look, but I have to touch and open. And sometimes it's the case that some of these books or some of these examples require a very intimate kind of examination, because as I didn't say, but one of the reasons why one is able to trace waste paper is often because the copy or the volume will be torn, for example. But if it's not torn, then it's it's a very careful, intimate, relationship with the object. But at the same time, I think that folds into not only me being a bookbinder, but also thinking about or the way in which these waste papers are witness of what's been done to these other books before. And so I think when coming across books that are torn, books that are worn, there's also a historical intimacy to the practice that was then done to the item in order for it to be what it is today. And then how those practices have traces of those people that once, performed those practices. And I think what is interesting specifically about the case of colonial bookbinding or post-colonial bookbinding or post-colonial and colonial spaces is that it's very rarely the case that we can actually come up with proper nouns of binders or proper nouns of binderies or people in charge. And so what we have in place of that are these documents. And so I think as a bookbinder, I'm very excited to find different ways in which people are doing things and different ways in which waste comes up in these materials. Thank you for your question.
Everybody hear me? Okay, good. Wow. I don't like hearing my voice. Okay, so this word intimacy will bring up a lot of emotions, so sorry for being cheesy if I am. But as a kid, I would walk by that library again and again, and parents and friends would be like, why do you want to go there? Don't go there, right? So that was the main thing. Of course, for other reasons as well, they would just not want me to be there. But now that I'm working with the materials, there's a lot of emotional investment in it because Zoroastrians as a community, we really obsess about our ancient past, about what it was like in Persia, things like that. But history moves and we move with it. And so there is all this stuff that's there we can look at and understand what happened in India, Pakistan, what happened in 1800s, 1900s, because a lot did happen, right? And now that everything is going into North America, what's important is its movement there and what libraries will do with this collection, you know, a traveling exhibition or just involving youngsters to be part of that and look through these things. So I think for me, that's my goal of intimacy because I didn't have it as a kid and I wish I did because I would have understood myself and my history better. So there's a lot of, you know, enviousness for the youth there. But really that's the goal, and that's the goal for a lot of community members who are creating library associations in North America. And they are really planning to bring things together. And so if you want, look up Fires Faizana. I can send you a spelling of that if you need. But there is a library catalog being created online for the Federation of Zoroastrian Associations in North America. And I'm hoping it'll create this personal and digital community archive for us here. And it is unfortunate though, because, you know, I'm coming from there. That's my home. So it is also a mourning process to lose that. And so I don't want to cry, but that is very important for me, right? And so intimacy works in a lot of ways, yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. If there are any questions, please.
Hey, Liz Denlinger. Wait, is this? Testing. Okay. This is a question for you. Liz Denlinger, yeah, sorry, NYPL. I just wanted to follow up, Mina. This is fascinating. And you had mentioned, well, one question is, how much of this library is being moved off-site? And second, you mentioned a digitization project, and I just wanted to ask how that's being carried out and, yeah, under whose auspices?
Did I do this? Yeah, important questions. So with Pakistan being the country it's in, there's a lot of things we as a community keep quiet about how things are moving. So I can talk to you about that personally. But they are moving secretly. That's all I'd say. Nothing is being just like officially stated that this is what's being brought outside. And that's just because it will not be allowed to be brought outside if it wasn't the case, and it would just be thrown away as waste if that was the case. So so that's the offsite thing, but it is coming here. So that's the more exciting part for me, that I don't have to go to Karachi. Yeah, the digitization, again, that's also by private funders, and that's because a lot of the national archives in Pakistan have a rule that the things that they will support in funding to digitize will have to be to do with the history of Pakistan or Sindh. Now, a lot of the texts are just to do with the Zoroastrian religion, so they won't digitize it, like subsidize it, right? So Zoroastrians are affluent, they have the funding, so they're putting the funding in now to start that personal digitization work. They just need better scanners, right? So that's what we're looking for. So I think right now they're in the fundraising process of accumulating that resource to buy a really good scanner for these materials. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm Erin Kipro. I work at the Lilly Library. This is a question for Javiera. I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit more about your methodology for discovering materials that have waste paper in the bindings and things like that. I imagine as a researcher that you probably don't have access to stacks. So how are you requesting to see these objects? Did you go through large swaths of materials? I'd love to know.
Thank you for that question. I love that question. So I think that question is twofold, and it has an answer for sadly, so like global northern libraries, and then it has an answer for southern cone colonial libraries. And so one of the things that happens is, well, when one is searching for something over and over again, you start recognizing patterns, right? And so now, a couple years into searching these volumes, I am like my eyes, okay, these are formats that are more likely to have waste paper than others. But we have libraries like the Folger that have tags for, in the notes within the catalog that have certain tags like printer's waste or binder's waste or waste paper, things like that. And so the same for the AAS. And so for me, it's really marvelous to come across catalogs where you have, this material text approach where what you can search within the catalog is not only textual, but it's also material. So encountering those things, it's easier. So then the search narrows, right? So that is one way in which I come across some of these things. Like I just go in there, of course, talking to the librarians, it's the first thing one should do, right? But then I have had access to stacks. That is the other thing. Because, for example, the library in which, and I fully, I find myself in your work so much because this is a library that it's one of the oldest libraries, if not the oldest collection in our country, like a colonial collection. It has no funding. It has only one librarian, and that's pretty much it. And sadly so, the collection itself, although wonderful, has an inventory, but it doesn't have a catalog. So it's really hard for researchers to actually use that collection. And so happily, when I go there, because I've also been going there for years, so it's a collection I have also a very intimate relationship with, I sometimes have access to the stacks. Right, I talk to Raquel and she says, okay, what do you need? And I was like, oh, this is what I need. And she's like, oh, okay, I have seen that. Why don't we go together and search together for these things? That takes more time, of course, but it also creates a very particular relationship with the material because one is finding in juxtaposition with other things, right? And so I think it's one or two. You start recognizing the objects that will most likely have, so in the case of waste paper, a smaller format is more likely to have waste paper than a larger format. If it's a format that it's bound after the 1800s and it's a case binding, it will most likely have waste paper on the spine, but in order for us to know that, it has to be torn, etc. So I think it's a great question because it also speaks onto the matter of institutional funding. and kinds of conservation. For my work specifically, it's wonderful to speak to the conservators and restorators, because one of the things that I'm looking for is like those items that have not been restored, that have not been preserved in ways that erase these kinds of historical traces. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott Casper from the American Antiquarian Society. This is a question for Jessica. Fascinating work on Brooks. I wonder, you described two kind of publishing worlds of which she's a part, the Negro Digest and Harper. Where does, at this time, isn't she also beginning or in the process of doing her work with Dudley Randall and Broadside Press? How does that fit into the story you're telling?
Yes, so In the Mecca is the last book that Brooks publishes with Harper and Row. She's no longer working with Elizabeth Lawrence at this time, but Elizabeth Lawrence is still quite involved. And pretty soon after, she publishes almost exclusively with Dudley Randall's Broadside Press and a little bit with Third World Press by Haki Makabudi. And I think it fits, like, you can see she's sort of foretelling this story as like with her own periodical, or her own poetry in this periodical in which she's like laying a path for her future print. And I think Brooks is someone who, like, she's almost emblematic of all of the shifts that happen in the mid-century, because she is with this major publisher that she's the first Black writer to win the Pulitzer Prize, and then she knowingly takes her cultural capital to small presses like Dudley Randall's Broadside Press, and not only does she just take her cultural capital there and publish things with them that allows this press to be financially solvent pretty quickly, although it was always a little on the rocks. She also hosts a number of the book launch events, and she hosts, whenever authors come to town, to Detroit or Chicago, she often will host them at her home. So I think she's in some ways like foretelling her own print changes. And back to this question of intimacy, like the intimacy is very much in these networks that she is developing with the various printers, publishers, et cetera.
Three cheers for Erin.
Hi, I'm Megan Cook. This is a question for Javiera, which is about the role that manuscript material plays in the work you're doing. So I was struck that, with the exception of, I think, one book from the Folger, where the exterior is clearly a reused manuscript, most of your examples were involving with printed material. So I'm just curious in what ways, if at all, manuscript material factors into your work.
Thank you for that. It does. Actually, I can't show them right now, but some of the examples I found in the Biblioteca Patrimonial Recoleta are manuscript, and most of them are letters. So I'm still reviewing them and trying to figure out, because what I was saying just now, it's one of the ways wastepaper has been studied previously is by using these materials to find like traces of, for example, manuscripts or other printed materials that we have lost or that we didn't know existed copies of yet. Actually, the last broadside that I show you, I was just recently, I found out that it's a broadside that there is no other copy of, right? And that's exciting. But at the same time, going back to your question of the manuscript, it's hard to trace where these materials come from. It's easier for print because you have sometimes multiple copies of an item. So I am yet trying to figure out how to factor this into the larger research. This is already very comparative. So introducing the printing versus manuscript aspect to it, it's going to prove challenging. But one of the things that I'm trying to think about is maybe not thinking about that duality as in opposition to each other. And so, as I was saying, I have found manuscript copies. Some of them are, as I was saying, letters, and I'm trying to figure out if those letters came with the binding, if maybe those are materials that were circulating within the convent itself. That would be exciting to find out, for example, because that would be proof that they were introduced into the copies on site, and that would speak of like the local economy of that specific Dominican or also maybe the Jesuits binding in Chile, which is exciting. But I would have to look into it.
I think there's a question in the back on that side of the room, and I think that will be the last for today.
Hi, I actually have two questions, so hopefully, and when I tell you what I do for a living, you won't be shocked. Alvin Patrick, I'm with CBS News. So I have a question for Sharmeen about how the partition in 1947 sort of played into where these books went, because I noticed that you talked about books that were Gujarati, which is mainly Indian. And so, and then I'll just say the second one as well for Jessica. I had a question about your point about Gwendolyn Brooks and the African diaspora. I guess my question is are you saying that she moved away from the Americanness and more toward international when you talk about it, because she's so very much American, right? You know. So anyway, that's just my question. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Trick. So your question is a very good one. The partition has been a lot on my mind now as I work through my dissertation. But I will begin first with that the language that Zoroastrians specifically speak in South Asia is Parsi Gujarati, which is a dialect of Gujarati. And it picks up more Persian words or roots than Sanskrit. And so it is something that any Zoroastrian community around the world, you will find the older generation speaking. This translation question had come up in the virtual session too. And so it is in dire need of being archived as well, because there are no classes for young people anymore in Gujarati. I need help with translations as well. So in that sense, it is, again, a language that's spoken everywhere. But the partition itself is interesting, and this is why this library is important, is because Dhalla is the only famous priest in Pakistan. Okay, so all the other priests, famous ones, are in India. So that's why you have a lot more libraries and resources in India for Zoroastrian manuscripts as well as other printed books. And so that is why this library in Pakistan is the only, I would say, existing one and still in use for Zoroastrians. And that's merely because Dhalla was the high priest of Pakistan and not India. And so this partition does play an important part. And another unfortunate thing that I did discuss in the virtual session is there was some smuggling of some of the manuscripts that belonged to this library. But when they were found, they were sent to India because more scholars can go there and do research, right? So the partition does still play its unfortunate parts in the history of where Zoroastrian studies goes in South Asia. Thank you.
Yes, also thank you. Your question makes me realize that an important part of this argument is perhaps not clear, which is I am not trying to make an argument that Brooks turns away from the national or the local in favor of the diasporic, not at all, but that when we read her poems in their original periodical context, we can understand that she is simultaneously speaking to these, and that her scales of belonging are radial, and that when she is able to sort of historicize certain moments in Chicagoan Black history, she's also speaking to a national issue. She's also speaking to a kind of anti-colonial discourse, and that I think that is within her poetry and within her poetry pre-1967. You know, scholars often make a major bifurcation in her work, and I think within periodicals we can see how that sharp turn is a little blunter or softer, and that she is not necessarily understanding any of these practices of belonging as mutually exclusive, but as like mutually reinforcing.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So that brings us to the end of the New Scholar session. I do have a long string of thank yous, so if you could wait 1 second, which is the one, a thanks to our new scholars for joining us, a thanks to you for welcoming them, not quite yet, a thank you to the committee, who I will thank individually in another context, and finally, just one point of order, which is that I'll free you to coffee in a moment if you could come back by 3. As you may have noticed, this is a very full house, so I'd encourage you to take the seats up front ahead of our keynote. Thank you.